Nadir Seif-Bensoussan, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Please take your mic closer to the mouth.
Good
Thank
afternoon.
You. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
And thank you very much for being with us today. We're continuing to talk about microbiome and all these very exciting topics which are linked to our main issues, of course, immunology and microbiology. And you are going to talk about mechanisms of the human gut barrier, lessons from monogenic disorders. We're going to listen to you. After that, I will have a few questions for you. And I remind all of you who are connected on this internet conference that you can ask your questions on the chat tool just at the bottom of the screen. You have a Q&R line on which you can tap your questions. They will come to me here on this tablet, and then I will be your spokesman. I will ask your questions. So please, during the presentation, don't hesitate, ask your questions. I will relay them. Thank you. Nadir Bensoussan, we're going to listen to you.
Well, first of all, thanks to the organizer for having giving me this opportunity to discuss our work on the mechanism of the gut immune barrier through the prism of monogenic disorders. Now, for a number of years, our team has tried to understand how the crosstalk between the gut epithelium and the immune system allow the host to cope with the massive load of microbes and dietary antigens which are present in the intestinal lumen. And we know that this crosstalk leads to a state of physiological inflammations, which is absolutely key to sustain the gut barrier, but which needs to be very strictly regulated to prevent pathological inflammations and maintain intestinal homeostasis. So we have taken two types of approach. One approach has been to try to identify microbes which drive the maturations of the gut homeostatic immune barrier. And this has notably led us to identify segmented filamentous bacteria as one very important species, at least in mice, probably perhaps in humans, but this needs to be seen. And the second and most prominent approach that we have taken is to dissect host mechanisms through the analysis of model genetically determined human disease. One is celiac disease for a long time, which is a disease which is multigenic disease, but strongly genetically defined, which can be considered as a common form of autoimmunity driven by dietary gluten, and more recently, monogenic disorders of the gut barrier. So why these disorders? Because we believe that they are modeled to dissect non-redundant key mechanisms of the human gut barrier, because we do need to improve the diagnosis and care of this rare but very severe disease, and also because we believe that they will provide clue to key pathways and therapeutic targets in more common form of IBD. So the methodology that we have chosen is to develop precisely phenotype cohorts, notably a pediatric cohort of now approximately 600 cases, but also more recently of adults, as we start to realize that some of these diseases can have a delayed onset. We have set up a pipeline for rapid identification of known disease, which is today mainly based on targeted next-generation sequencing. And for cases left without diagnosis and which are most severe, we rely on unbiased approach based mainly on whole exome and hopefully soon on genome sequencings. And indeed, we go on with functional validations. So doing so, we have identified molecular defect in approximately 30% of the patients of the cohort, implicating 48 genes, which, as you can see on this relatively colorful scheme, can actually be divided in three groups. A first group of defects which impair the differentiation or the function of the epithelium, which leading to congenital diarrhea that I will not discuss today. And two other groups affecting immune genes, either of the innate immune system or the adaptive immune system, which lead, to our surprise, to very distinct type of clinical presentations that I'm going now to discuss. So we have, on the one hand, disease affecting the upper part of the intestines, which presents features of what we could call autoimmune enteropathy, characterized by villus atrophy with lymphocytic infiltrates. This is often associated with food allergy or severe atopic skin disease, and also often with autoimmunity, extraintestinal autoimmunity, with cytopenia and endocrinopathy. These patients can have colitis, but if they have a colitis, it's a lymphocytic colitis or a graft versus host-like disease. Well, actually, pointing to the role of lymphocytes. And indeed, this autoimmune type of enteropathy are really associated with defect of the adaptive immune systems and can be ascribed to a disbalance between the Treg and the T effector lymphocytes. So on the one hand, we have a disease affecting predominantly the regulatory T cells, which manifest with autoimmunity often associated with allergy. One emblematic disease is a defect in FOXP3, a nuclear factor indispensable to the differentiation of Treg. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have a defect impairing the regulation of effector T cells. And most of the disease that I have put on the right of the slides actually enhance the JAK-STAT pathway. And in the middle, we have disease which affect both regulatory T cells and effector T cells, with two diseases concerning molecules which are related, LRBA and CTLA4, which are important for both Treg and effector T cells regulation. So here, what is interesting is that we, in fact, have, well, there are some very severe defects which need hematopoietic stem cell transplantations, but there are some other defects where we have targeted therapy. For the CTLA4 defect, CTLA4 agonist, and for disease affecting effector functions, JAK inhibitors. And indeed, we have ourselves used successfully the JAK inhibitor in a very severe case of enterocolitis in a young woman who had become refractory to all treatment, and she's now completely in clinical remissions after more than 3 years of this treatment. And it's probably worthwhile to mention the use of tofacitinib in a recent identified disease caused by JAK1 gain-of-function mutations. And here they have insisted on the fact that besides JAK1 activations, there were illegitimate activation of JAK3, making tofacitinib more particularly interesting. So on this slide, I will try to illustrate how monogenic disorders can sometimes point to pathways which are key for more common disease. And here it's the case of celiac disease. For a long time, we have known that this disease was associated with the production of cytokine which activate the JAK-STAT pathway. But we have recently shown that the lymphoma, which are rare but very characteristic of this disease, are in almost 100% of the case associated with somatic mutations of the JAK-STAT pathway, making notably JAK1 and STAT3 pathway, showing illustrating the importance of a strict regulation of this pathway for the homeostasis in the small intestine. So now, by oppositions, let's see what happens in inflammations affecting the lower part of the intestine, the colitis, associated or not with ulcerations and perianal lesions. And here, what is very striking is that the genes that we see are innate immune genes, illustrating probably the importance of this innate immunity to cope with the microbiota and maintain colonic homeostasis. So we have genes affecting bacterial clearance, compromising bacterial clearance, notably with XIAP, and all the genes controlling the productions of reactive oxygen species, the NADPH deficiencies. We have then genes which regulate strictly the colonic inflammations in response to the microbiota. And we have notably a very emblematic defect with affecting the regulations of IL-10. And we have also recently identified mutations in alkaline phosphatase, an enzyme which is very key to prevent excessive inflammations driven by LPS. And we have also genes controlling activation of the inflammasome, leading to hyperproductions of IL-18 or IL-1 beta, depending on the defects, lack of regulations of NF-kappa B, leading to uncontrolled response to TNF, or lack of TGF-beta. And again, this disease show that it's possible, when you know the pathway, to block specifically the disease, using notably in case of inflammasome defect in inflammasome regulations, the possibility to block IL-18 or IL-1 beta, or eventually TNF, depending of the defect. So I don't want actually to say that we find in all cases monogenic disorders, and to our surprise, even in very young children, in the case of colitis, well, in the case of autoimmune enteropathy, the diagnostic yield is very high. However, in the case of colitis, and notably the children without perianal lesions, the yield is low, either because we do not know all the defects, but more likely because many of these cases are actually multifactorial form of IBD, which appears even in these very young children. And this is probably to put in perspective of the recent increase of IBD in children, which followed the increase in incidence which has been observed over the past 40 or 50 years in adults, illustrated here in the EPIMAD registry in the north of France, as well as by the data collected by Bénédicte Pigneur from the health insurance system. So most probably, we have to believe that in these very young children, as has been now well established in adult case of IBD, there is a role of the microbiota, and it's very likely that the change of the microbiota that I have illustrated on the scheme on the left, which comes from a very famous study from the group of Gordon, showing that the microbiota has changed in industrialized countries. These changes, which are associated with a reduction in diversity, the emergence of pro-inflammatory species, often called pathobionts, is thought to play a very important role in these epidemics of IBD. Notably because it compromises very likely the trade-off which has been evolved by the host immune system with our intestinal microbes during our long coevolutions. So I will finish here and to say that this leaves us with a number of challenges, clearly to pursue the building and the genetic exploration of our cohort with the hope to further translate our results in improvement of diagnosis and care. We realize now that we have, as in adults, to apprehend non-genetic mechanisms accounting for the earlier and earlier onset of IBD in children, and we hope to do that in the context of the INSERM transversal program in microbiota, notably with Gérard Heberl, that you are going to hear soon. Or Arisocol. And we also expect, and this is quite important, I believe, is to use the data that we have derived from monogenic IBD in order to stratify patients with IBD of complex inheritance and to guide personalized therapies for this disease, where we really need to know better. And we expect to rely on single cells analysis and to artificial intelligence-based integrations and predictive approach in collaborations and within the frame of the RH4 attraction projects coordinated by Frédéric Rieuleca, and Frédéric will actually present this initiative. And just here to say that this work has not been done alone, and there are many people who have been involved, perhaps to also to thank all the collaborators in France and abroad, and to acknowledge the remarkable support of the platform that we have at Institut Imagine. Voilà, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Nadine Serbensoussan. This was impressive, really, because we can see that all the findings you did, and we're going to talk about them. And you quoted Frédéric Rieuleca. Indeed, he will come back, he will come and he will talk with Michel Didier and Mohamed Afshar in a few minutes about this initiative that's called Attraction Project. That's it. You take part to the project yourself?
Well, we are a part of the project, actually in charge of the part which concerns the microbiome. So it will be for us a very good opportunity at Imagines to put the environment and the microbiome in the context of autoimmune disease, which I think is absolutely key today.
Yeah, indeed. So we'll talk further about that in a few minutes from now. So I remind you that you can ask your questions on your chat tools in the bottom of the screen. I already have a few of them, but you can carry on because we have a few minutes together to talk and to exchange on your presentation and your work. First question I've got, beyond a better management of very severe but very rare diseases that you talked about, can the studies carried out on monogenic intestinal diseases help to understand or manage more common diseases?
Well, what we hope, in fact, is that by defining a signature for a precise pathway, which are well delineated in these monogenic disorders, we can actually establish signatures which can be used to investigate patients with more common form of IBD, which are very likely heterogeneous. And at the present time, it's very difficult to choose correctly. We have a wide spectrum of biological therapies which are available, but finally, we do not know exactly the one to choose at first. And so the idea to use these monogenic disorders to have signatures and to use these signatures to guide therapy would be probably, hopefully, not too long ago, something which would be extremely useful.
Oh, this is a great challenge. You say not too long ago. How long time do you imagine?
Well, you will ask Frédéric Rioloca what is his expectations for the RHU4, but we have to succeed within 5 years. So
5 years?
No. Well, at least to have clues and tracks.
Clues.
So well,
okay. So we hope so too. Another question: in inflammatory disease affecting the upper part of the intestine, or what we call the small intestine, the yield of molecular diagnosis is high. You said it just in a few minutes ago. Do you also identify monogenic causes in adults with immune-mediated enteropathies?
Yes, indeed, because of the high yield that we had of genetic diagnosis in children with almost 60%, we decided to see whether it could explain some rare case of autoimmune enteropathy that we could not understand. And indeed, the yield in adults in this type of disease is high, probably more than 30%, at least in the preliminary study that we have done. So it's certainly worthwhile in autoimmune enteropathy in adults which are not linked to celiac disease and which are refractory to the gluten-free diet to try to find these disorders. We were a little bit more disappointed when we turned to regular IBD in adults, and I must confess that even in the most severe cases, refractory to all treatments, the yield of diagnosis is low, and so we, for the time being, we reserve the genetic diagnosis to patients who are so sick that autologous stem cell transplantations is considered to try to eliminate any monogenic disorders before doing this transplantation.
A third question. Surprisingly, many cases of chronic and severe colitis, starting even in very young children, seem to be a multifactorial origin and not because of a monogenic disease. Does it mean that our microbiota is involved, even very young, a disordered, ever change in its composition maybe?
Well, we know that the diversity of the microbiota has changed in the general population in industrialized countries. It's very likely that this lack of diversity in the adults, which is now well documented in adults, is probably transmitted by the mother to the children. Also, and so it seems to me extremely likely that this change in diversity can have an impact. And Gerard Eberle, that you will hear very soon, has obtained very important data showing how the compositions of the microbiota early in life, at least in mice, has indeed a long-standing effect on the risk to develop further disease. And we have now a number of epidemiological studies and also functional studies in humans showing how the microbiota of the very young children can impact the risk to develop allergy and inflammatory disease at the adult age or even later in infants, in childhood.
So as you said, the microbiota is transmitted through the mother. So it means that it depends on what the mother eats and how she behaves.
Well, the microbiota can have a reduced diversity because not only, no, well, do not accuse the mother only.
No, I don't accuse them
first,
at all. Not only them.
one first reasons to have less diverse microbiota or the microbiota less enriched in beneficial microbes is to be born by cesarean, and indeed the microbiota of children born by cesarean, at least during the first months, is different from the microbiota of children born vaginally by the regular
natural way.
The natural way. And so that's one, and indeed there is an association between cesarean and the risk of allergy and inflammatory bowel disease later in life. Another mechanism is the administrations of antibiotics early in childhood. And then, indeed, we can perhaps go to the mothers and the microbiota of the mothers during the pregnancy, as not directly because there is no translocation, fortunately, of microbes into the child, but the metabolites which derive from the mothers can actually cross the placenta and probably influence the development of the immune system of the child. And there are data in mice which show that. And also the microbiota that the child inherits at birth can be modified. Well, actually, is from the mothers, so can be modified.
Well, it can change, and even several times in life, it depends on what we eat, what we do, the pollution, the environmental issues.
Clearly, it's probably one main factor which controls our microbiota is the diet. And the microbiota of the child will actually depend on if it's breastfed or not breastfed, and we know today that breastfeeding will allow the growth of bifidobacterium, which seems to have a positive and beneficial influence on the development of the immune system of the child. And I take this opportunity to say that OMS recommend that all mothers breastfeed almost exclusively for 6 months, which as a working mother, a past working mother, I must confess that I've not respected, but difficult. It's true that I've tried to respect it at least for 3 months.
Yeah, it turned out to be very difficult in modern life.
Yeah, so it's a little bit complicated in modern life, except if there are some arrangements made by in companies and so on to promote this type of breastfeeding for the children. But that's another story.
This is another problem, and women and moral and mental charge and everything. So it's a total consideration. We have to take it into account. There is another question. Thanks a lot for answering your questions on the chat tool. QC asks, I just get the two letters QC, the strategy to target microbiome will be a better way to prevent diseases or to treat diseases?
Alors, to prevent disease, it's clearly a big challenge. We know that the diet, we know that the antibiotics, and more generally all the medicaments have a strong, the pollutants have a strong influence on the microbiota. So clearly, coming back to a diet which is propitious to modify the compositions of the diet to reduce pro-inflammatory species and promote the growth of more anti-inflammatory species is certainly something which is key. Reduce the amount of the intake of antibiotics is also very key for preventing this disease. And in terms of treatment, it's true that in a number of diseases, the idea to modify of inflammatory disease, notably of inflammatory bowel disease, the idea to modify the microbiota to try not to cure perhaps the disease, but at least to prevent relapse is something which is coming out with notably the work of Ari Sokol, who is trying to develop this strategy.
Thank you very much, Nadine Serve-Bensoussan. This was really interesting. And of course, as soon as we talk about the microbiota, we have so many ideas. It's something which has a great echo in the society. So thanks a lot. And we hope that all your research will succeed and that it will be the occasion for new treatments in a very close future.